Welcome to this second of two webinars focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa and European Union migration. My name is Jesper Bjarnesen. I'm a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today. I imagine that some of you are braving the cool weather of the Southern Hemisphere, and others of you are trying to resist the temptation of being outside in the European summer. So I'm very grateful to see you all here. This is the second of two webinar series co-organized by the Nordic Africa Institute and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. And I would like to, on behalf of the Nordic Africa Institute, and acknowledging that our director, Therese Commander Magnusson, is also present here today, like to just express my gratitude towards the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation for this collaboration, this partnership. I would especially like to acknowledge the director, Professor Adekeya Adebajo, who's also with us today, and senior researcher Adeoye Akinoa, who is also here. I will mention him a couple of times before I hand over to our speakers. And then research coordinator Terry Maggott, whose name and presence I'm sure you've all felt in the communication around this event. Before I introduce the two speakers for today, I'd like to just briefly, first of all, express that at the Nordic Africa Institute, we are a Swedish public authority tasked with providing research-based and Africa-centered knowledge on social, political, and economic dynamics in contemporary Africa. And this kind of engagement is exactly one of the avenues that we're most passionate about, being able to collaborate with capable and engaged partners on the African continent in providing current perspectives on ongoing issues. So this is really a great opportunity for us, and we're really grateful for this opportunity. The format of today's seminar will be two 10-minute presentations by our invited speakers, followed by a question and answer session that I will moderate. You're welcome to ask your questions in the chat on the Zoom function. Please be as brief and precise as possible. In the Q&A session, I will call upon you to ask the questions in person so that we have more of a sort of a dialogue, but I will ask you to please be as brief as possible. And writing your questions in the chat function will enable me to perhaps pair questions with similar interests, and also to have sort of an order of selecting the questions. So please use the chat function as you see fit for that purpose. I should also say before I forget that we will be sending out an evaluation form after the webinar. So please share your opinions on the webinar so that we can learn from it for future events. And finally, before we begin, I would just like to mention a few issues that came up during our first webinar, which was held 2 weeks ago. At that event, the two speakers were Dr. Ahmed Bouré and Dr. Francisca Sanka, and the recording of that webinar is available on the website of both the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation and the Nordic Africa Institute. So please have a look if you were not present. I know that some of you are coming back for more, as it were. The theme of the first seminar was an overall look at the impact of the pandemic on EU-Africa relations around migration governance. And the observations were not unfamiliar. There were sort of familiar themes of restating the persistent divide between African and European perspectives on migration and migration governance. There was the observation that somewhat paradoxically, while these two sides are obviously not unified or internally coherent, there is a tendency for the African Union to be sort of the main platform for articulating African positions in negotiations on migration governance, but that that position has been the weaker in that relationship historically and even today. On the European side, there's much more of a divided spectrum, in part because of the politicized environment around migration from the global south in Europe. But at the same time, and that's the paradox, while the European side is fragmented politically and in terms of outlooks, it has been the dominant party in the relationships around migration governance. Yeah, as I said, you can see the full discussion and presentations in the recording from the previous webinar, so I won't waste any more time on summarizing that now. I should just mention as a framing that in addition to these two webinars, the collaboration between our two institutes is also taking the form of a joint book project around the issue of migration governance. The provisional title is Worlds Apart, African and European Perspectives on Migration, and both the invited speakers are contributors to that book. Unfortunately, Ms. Ahuna Isiakonwa, who is the Regional Director and Assistant Secretary General for the UN Development Programme, Regional Bureau for Africa, was prevented at the last minute from joining us, but we are very happy to welcome her replacement, as it were. Ms. Isiakonwa is providing a chapter for our book project, as is our second speaker, Ananol. I'll introduce them both a bit further shortly. But again, I want to acknowledge the collaboration with the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, and especially my co-editor on this book project, Dr. Adeoye Akinola. So thank you very much for that, Oye. It's good to see you virtually again. I hope you will all be interested in following this book project as it develops. All right, without any further ado, let me invite our first speaker. So to replace Ms. Isiakonwa, we are very happy and grateful to have Dr. Joy Kategekwa. I'm really sorry if I pronounced that wrong. With us today, she is the Strategic Advisor to the Regional Director and Assistant Secretary General at the Bureau for Africa for the UNDP in New York. So thank you very much for coming at such a short notice. And I will invite you to give us the first presentation, 10 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Jasper, for the kind introduction. And again, apologies that Ahuna, the Assistant Secretary General, could not be with us today. So I have 10 minutes to sort of start the conversation, and you've asked us to focus our remarks on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa-EU migration with a reflection on the UN Global Compact. And as we know, the UN Global Compact is that piece, that framework to which the community of nations have committed themselves to be guided by on migration governance. And I think it's important to sort of contextualize that we're really talking about safe, orderly, regular migration as the aspiration, the frame for the Global Compact. So my remarks will have three broad themes. One is the status of COVID in Africa. The second is what we see as the EU response. And the third is how we could move towards the aspirations of the Global Compact. And so let's start with COVID in Africa. I think it's accurate to say that Africa is not the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. We say this because, well, you know, as of yesterday, 25th June, you have about 340,000 confirmed cases, which represent about 3.6 of the global confirmed cases. Africa's fatality rate, 2.6, which is half the global average. The average is 5.1. And so you see that Africa is really not the epicenter on the epidemiological angle of the pandemic, but it is certainly of grave concern when we talk about the socioeconomic impact, because the socioeconomic impact arrived well before perhaps the first recorded case of COVID-19, when we think about what it has done to jobs and livelihoods. And here it is really about the combined impact of a decrease in demand of African exports on the one hand, and a disruption in supply chains that has made it difficult to have essential imports on the continent. And this has had an impact on livelihoods on the continent. Another important sort of effect we already see is this question of remittances, because we know that portion of migrants' income that is sent home is critical. In a sense, it is perhaps the social safety net for many African families, remittances. And we've grown to see a lot of analysis that talks about the important role remittances play vis-a-vis ODA, for example. And when you have crashes down in remittance flows, the World Bank predicts that in 2020, Africa's remittances will reduce by 23.1%, reaching 37 billion from 48 billion. And those numbers are important because what they tell us is a reduced source of safety nets in a situation where these countries also don't have social protection. And so that, in a sense, is a way to frame it. And so in terms of summarizing what this impact really is of COVID-19 in Africa, one, it is not the epicenter. Two, the socioeconomic impact is biting hard. And third, the impact of COVID-19 in Europe is having an impact on Africa directly. And now I'll talk about the response in Europe. And so when you think about the number of migrants, African migrants in Europe, the numbers vary. Some estimates point to about 5 million. But IOM also tells us that those that are not regular, the irregular migrants, would be in the range of a similar number. So 5 million as well. And so we're really talking about a substantial number of people called migrants in Europe. And we fear that what COVID-19 is doing is that it's going to impact on the relations between Africa and Europe, especially also those who are fleeing political persecution. Why do we say that? Let's look then at what the EU response has been. So a number of European countries, for example, Italy and for example, Austria, we seem to see a move towards tighter policies, hardened policies around migration, immigration in the wake of COVID-19. Issues around stopping vessels carrying migrants from docking at European ports. And some have also gone to say that their ports are no longer, their harbors are no longer safe places for migrants to land. Now, of course, what that means, it's a bit of a continuation in a trend that we have seen before, but it certainly says that there is a hardening of policies around migration, immigration in the wake of COVID-19. I think there have been press reports also about Africans sort of ostracized, maligned as carrying more the disease. And so we see a lot of tendencies that are worrying. Research from ECDPM is also telling us that, some of the responses, especially the harsh ones, could end up being counterproductive, pushing migrants further underground. Further underground meaning more exposure to the disease. But when you think about a fragment of the migrants, which are refugees and irregular migrants, you see that they're being pushed into perhaps a much more precarious situation. But I think it's also important to note that many are losing jobs, as we've said, the impact on remittances. And it's also critical there to say that in spite of the perceived problem with migrants and the hardening of positions against migrants, they are in fact playing a role as part of the solution. I think many know the statistics around how most of the health essential workers would in one way or the other be migrants. And so the World Bank, in its spring edition of 2020, in its World Economic Outlook, it documents how immigrants in advanced economies increase output and productivity, both in the short and medium term. And they have statistics there where they say that a 1% point increase in the inflow of immigrants relative to total employment could have increased output by almost 1% by the 5th year. The Secretary General of the United Nations, also in his messaging around the protection of migrants in the COVID-19 context, has just released a policy brief on people on the move and COVID-19. And there he highlights a sort of three-dimensional crisis, a triple crisis on health, on socioeconomic impact, and on the protection crisis. We see in that policy brief his message around skyrocketing xenophobia, racism, stigmatization. And then there we see also further concern that the already precarious situation of women and girls gets further complicated. And because we know most migration takes place in Africa, it's important to look at what the numbers tell us about Africa. And so IOM has been tracking this. In West Africa, you see a 48% decrease in migrants. 30,000 migrants are stranded at borders across Africa. 21%, 2,000 herders of transhuman, transhuman herders also stuck at various borders of Africa. So there's two dimensions to that, the European one, but also there's the African context. And I now move into what do we do differently? And what do we do differently really is going back to the frame of the Global Compact, safe, orderly, regular migration. And the answers might in fact be in the EU-Africa strategy. The March 2020 unveiled strategy has 5 priority areas: green transition, digital transformation, growth and jobs, and one of them, number 5, is migration and mobility. And there I think it's an opportunity to really look at COVID-19 as the space where you can have a new, fresh conversation around how to better structure migration relationship, migration governance between the EU and Africa. And here we present a short 6-point program. The first one is really to support transformative development in Africa. I think it's important that we always remember the push-pull factors within and around migration. What if EU invested in the strengthening of African capacities, including through policies of trade and policies of investment, where you do value addition on the continent, where you create an environment on the continent that allows for self-actualization of the dreams of Africa's young people. So we use the footprint that we're seeing develop on the continent in terms of the ingenuity of innovators and so on the continent to believe that Africa can, to believe that Africa is producing, and to say, Europe, come and join in supporting that production process so that the push factors are reduced. The second one is to say, to facilitate a transition from ungoverned to governed by having more rules, regulations, and implementing them that take people out of the shadows that protect migrants. The third is really investing in long-term building of a new discourse on migration in Europe. We've seen the harsh policies, we've seen the trend behind the harsh policies, but I think we need to come to the table and start to have a conversation around the reality of having to deal with this situation in a manner that emphasizes human dignity, human rights, but I dare add that emphasizes the duality of migration between Europe and Africa, because it is not true that Africa does not host European migrants. The fourth point would be to reduce the cost of remittance transfers. The costs currently, I think these were figures we have from April, the first quarter of 2020. If you're sending $200, you're paying 8.9% in remittance costs. We recall that the SDGs really aim for below 3%. And so what can the EU do in facilitating regimes that reduce the costs for remittances? The fourth point is to fight exclusion of migrants in the COVID-19 response. It is important that we uphold the human dignity of everybody by ensuring that the diagnostics, the treatment, the vaccines are accessible to all. And the fifth, and it will be the last point, is this question of embracing also more intra-African migration. The trends tell us that is what is truly happening. We need to embrace the protocol on free movement in the African Union. We need to embrace the African Continental Free Trade Area as opportunities for migration, intra-African migration. I will close by echoing a portion of the administrator of UNDP's forward in our recent report 2019 called Scaling Fences. And there he says, and I quote, "Migration is a reverberation of unseen, uneven development, and particularly of a development trajectory that is failing young people. This should send a strong message to policymakers. We must not become distracted by the false promise of short-term fixes, such as unnecessary harsh domestic policies and diverting much-needed development assistance from core priorities. Doing so may only serve to further circumscribe the ambitions of young Africans instead of fostering and harnessing their potential as an engine of transformative change." So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that very concise and informative presentation. I think that overall, one of the messages I take from it is that there is already in the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration, and in some of the negotiations around the joint EU-Africa strategy, there is sort of food for, or the substance we need for a more productive and open-ended and holistic approach to migration governance. So many of the facets are already there, and it's kind of to me a reminder that the pandemic should not set us back in the gains already achieved. I should have said, and I'm glad that you began by reminding us that this particular webinar is focused on the impact of the pandemic on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. So thank you for being so explicit and clear about that. The idea of the webinar has been to invite both African and European perspectives, and of course there are quite a few overlaps both in the interests of our two speakers and of that theme. It's very difficult to disentangle those two views, and that's not necessarily the purpose either. But I'd like to invite our second speaker to add perhaps the intention was to add a European or Europe-focused perspective, but I'm sure that there will be sort of an equal entanglement of the African and European perspectives to some extent, but I still think that's a very valuable contribution. So I'd like to invite Anna Knoll, who's the head of the migration program at the European Center for Development Policy Management in Maastricht in the Netherlands, to give us the next 10 minutes of inputs for this reflection. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much, Jesper. And I would like to first of all also extend my thank you to the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation and the Nordic Africa Institute for having me as the speaker of the second two-part webinar series. Indeed, I mean, we call ourselves an independent think tank. So while we are based in Europe, we try to inform from an independent viewpoint. But of course, we'll talk a bit more about the European developments and perspectives. I also want to talk about 3 points and drawing on some of the research and monitoring we've been doing in the context of EU-Africa discussions. I will give a very quick word about context, but I think we've heard a lot already, so I'll keep that very short. Then I'll want to move to the priorities of both EU and Africa cooperation on migration with a view to the planned summit for October and the new EU-Africa partnership. And then third, a reflection on the role of the Global Compact in this. And I'll finish also with some suggestion recommendations as encouraged. First, on context, again, I don't want to go into detail, but I think some of the critical issues that have been laid out already last time, but also now by Antonia, on the impact of some of the policy measures, border closures, flows of remittances and the drops to the situation of migrants and the disruption of mobility are all very key for the discussion also of the Global Compact. And I find it interesting that I feel, again, we've seen that despite the frameworks that exist at the international level, and also comprehensive frameworks between EU and Africa, migrants and their families are often first to lose in a crisis. But at the same time, we've seen, and that has been mentioned last time, and I think it's important to highlight a number of policy processes actually accelerated in terms of giving rights to migrants, including them in some of the health provisions, trying to, calls by the UK and Swiss government to issue safeguarding to remittances that is being joined increasingly by governments. So I feel we've also seen this parallel sped up of measures, and that at least gives a little bit of a glimpse of hope, maybe, that it's not all bad. But of course, I feel the sort of discussions also on the Global Compact implementation has become more difficult with the COVID situation. I think what is important that we still have to see what the longer term impacts will be around how the pandemic also shapes discussions around globalism, nationality, national sovereignty, and migration as part of it. And while I've said I think it makes it more difficult to advance on some of the elements of the compact, it's precisely the spirit of the compact and the partnership approach that seems to be needed to safeguard some of the benefits in this. So in a sense, it's good to have that reflection also in the EU-Africa context. So what are some of the priorities with a view to the Europe-Africa partnership on migration and mobility that is currently in preparation and discussed on both sides with a view to the summit, which we don't know yet will happen in October, but there's sort of preference, at least at the EU side, that it would. From the European side, one can see on the one hand sort of this talk and effort to reinvigorate the partnership with Africa as a true partnership, to lift it to one of more equal relations between the two blocs. But then on migration specifically, it's perhaps best to look at what the EU is currently internally discussing on the envisaged EU pact on migration. which will also influence the EU objectives for the partnership with Africa and the position at the summit for sure, and where we see the tone is a bit different. As Jesper just has mentioned in the introduction, we discussed last summer that Europe has been divided and fragmented politically on the question of migration overall, but actually not so much on the external dimension that is one of the blocks of the pact. So, and we can see that in the current discussion. So while now the pact has been delayed, also due to COVID, and possibly due to strong disagreements on some of the internal responsibility sharing aspects, on the external side, that actually has stood quite firm already since sort of end of last year. And where it is going is sort of a reinforcement of what we've seen before. So I think the pact is likely to reaffirm the importance of the external dimension of migration policy, also to kind of compensate the slow progress on internal decision making. There's wide support for greater cooperation with third countries on migration management, but with a strong focus to utilize all the leverages, as the EU has sort of done before, of its external action tools, so visas, development aid, trade, to secure cooperation from third countries, especially as concerns readmission and return. So it's kind of an even, I would say, stronger push from what I hear also from the side of development cooperation to continue down that route. So yeah, approach more of the same with more force, I would say. Then if we look at the African position as far as sort of the monitoring from some of their input papers, obviously they take as a starting point the migration policy framework for Africa as a guideline for a future agreement, legal pathways and mobilities, labor migration, also building capacity for migration management, taking some of the lessons from COVID on public health and protection of migrants, as well as diaspora and remittances as the key areas, which then again comes back to what we discussed last time, that the positions are quite diverse. Now, if we go to the role of the compact on how that has featured so far in this discussion on EU-Africa relations on migration. On the EU side, the Global Compact is not the predominant framework under which the new EU Pact, for example, on migration is being discussed, and also not how EU-Africa cooperation is necessarily framed or being discussed. I think that is not necessarily surprising, given that not all EU member states are in agreement or standing behind the Global Compact. So it is quite, well, most EU member states do, but some do not. So that translates at the international level. While the EU Commission can support partner countries in their endeavors to implement the compact sort of financially and support that, the EU as a whole will not be able to easily base its bilateral or regional agreements on the pact, because that would be blocked by some of its EU member states. And that creates a real dilemma also for the EU internally, but I think the common consensus is that it is sort of just dropped from the framing and the language. On the African side, I also don't see the EU position making a reference or naming the compact as an overarching framework for the partnership, sort of more emphasizing the alignment with African frameworks. Though parallel discussions with the African Caribbean Pacific group, there was actually quite a strong demand to have as an umbrella the overall framing of the compact. So it does come back. And I feel sort of research that we've done in Nigeria, Senegal, also now I read this morning Somalia, they more strongly place their national policies in the context of the global framework, sometimes revising their national migration policy frameworks, but also from discussions I had demanding that there is some sort of streamlining of all the processes ongoing, from Valletta action plan to the regional ones, to have a more common umbrella term which would, in their view, be usefully the Global Compact. Now, if I come to some of the recommendations, or maybe also questions for discussion, I think for the EU, there needs to be still a real clear rethinking how the approach to conditionality, that is, as I said, getting more strong, can be squared with this notion of a true partnership approach, which it also sets as an objective. And I think for African counterpart, it also a question of what that means, because it's much more of a transactional approach, Whereas the African governments so far have also reacted in the same way, saying, okay, if there's no progress on legal migration, why should we cooperate otherwise? So it just kind of reinforces. So I think for both sides, there is sort of still a lot of work to figure out what it means to have a true partnership. And if we define partnership as also meaning compromise, sort of where that middle ground actually lies, where both are prepared to make concessions on the strong interest of either part and where not. So I feel right now it's a reiteration of strong interests that does not necessarily come together. And so there is still some month until the summit that I hope there's some more work on this. It surely, in my view, needs to include a more balanced approach beyond sort of the control and restrictions, including mobility partnerships, safeguarding also now with the COVID situation for mechanisms that work in crisis, that possibly integrate some of the health screening, testing, tracing of migrants. As we've seen, mobility does play a factor in also transmit some of the virus across borders. So to safeguard the mobility and migration part, there is, I think, where also some cooperation can take place to build these systems jointly. I feel there needs to be some learning on existing mobility schemes that exist. For example, bilaterally, one I've looked at was Spain and Senegal, where there seems to be a need to much more closely link them to also training, employment, and recruitment. So, because some of the negative experience that we had, and I think where there's now trying to be improvements to be made, aligned around the fact of a mismatch between sort of the expectations on the training or human resource part and the recruitment, leading to example for very low return numbers, for some dissatisfaction of companies. So I think that would be usefully be included in a mobility partnership. And I'll keep it short because I'm almost at the end of my time. I also feel there needs to be some sort of question on the follow-up and the process of the Africa-Europe partnership, and that's my last point. There's now, again, thinking of having a more permanent dialogue structure to advance the partnership that comes out of this summit, hopefully, with the AU-EU involved, the continent-to-continent discussion, but also with member states. And we know from the JAS, the Joint Africa-EU strategy in the past, that did have a mobility, migration and employment component, that one of the issues was that the EU and the African Union discussed, but the member states on both sides were not involved. And that's a problem because with migration, you have a lot of the competences where actual progress can be made at the national level. So I think that needs to be a real effort to include this in the cooperation and the follow-up, even if it's only some member states on both sides that do have a strong interest. But I think that has to be part of the approach, rather than to not have it sort of a summit-to-summit statement as it was in the past. And then on the compact, again, the role for researchers and also civil society, I think, to be strongly monitoring and making the link and the connection to the global framework, checking whether things are in the spirit of it or not, as I feel that politically there's a real risk that we end up not having as a strong framework. So there's some work to be done by, I guess, all of us to see how all these different frameworks, cooperate, correspond to each other. I'll leave it at that, and thank you again, and hope we have a good discussion around these points.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you to both speakers. I think you both provide these important nuanced views of the situation in the context of the pandemic that we really need in order to think as productively and precisely about these dynamics as possible. There are a lot of things I would like to ask too, but so while I think our listeners, our audience, collect their thoughts, I think I would like to start by asking you both a question, because you seem to have slightly different views of the role of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and you're both much more experienced than I am in actually following and analyzing the road from the broad statements and frameworks to actual policy and implementation. So the question maybe we could start by is to both of you, is the Global Compact or similar frameworks, so whether at the EU level or the African Union level, are these broad frameworks where things are happening? Is that where the negotiations are taking place? Is that where the stakeholders are most interested? Or are other platforms or other contexts or other frameworks more important than these broad, very sort of perhaps politically framed agendas? So are we looking at the wrong forum or the wrong platforms by focusing on the Global Compact, or where do you see the negotiations happening? So maybe I could ask Joy first, and then Anna to share some reflections on that, and then we'll open up for the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jesper. The Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is a critical policy document. It's a critical global framework because, as I said at the start, it is where the members of the United Nations have come together to agree on how they will do migration governance, migration in all of its forms, in a sense, migration governance, how they will manage the safe, orderly, regular movement of people. I think its ideals are important because at the core of that is the respect for human dignity, the respect and acknowledgement of migration as part of a solution, and how it contributes importantly to families, to economies, and so on and so forth. But it is where it is, which is this global framework, setting an aspiration. What is needed then, of course, is for countries, regions to take it down and use its thinking in framing how it is that they govern migration. And so when you look at parallels in Africa, I think that you would be looking at aspirations of that in some of the important protocols that are coming out of the continent. For example, the Protocol on Free Movement of the African Union, which is a critical one because it builds on sub-regional advancements that have always looked at the level of sub-regional, a rights-based approach to movement. You have a right to move, to establish, to reside, and so on and so forth. So that protocol is critical because then it gets into the way of creating opportunities for people to move at the table, not under the table, and to facilitate that movement. Another important instrument at the continental level is the African Union Continental Free Trade Area, which has a protocol on trade in services, an existing protocol that entered into force as the entire agreement came into force. And as we spoke at the first webinar, there is important sort of inroads there for people to move across a range of services sector, professional services, business services, tourism, transport, finance related, and so on. And so I feel that the more we use those sort of solutions that naturally must come from the ground while bringing to life the aspirations of the Global Compact, the better. I would end my comments there by saying, ultimately, the solution at the global level remains that compact, because as we're seeing, COVID has affected all countries in different ways. We're going to see much more push factors if we see those as a response to challenges in opportunities at home, in what your economies can give you, in how far your dreams can be attained in your jurisdiction. We're going to have to see more migration as COVID sort of subsides because the push factors have increased. And therefore, we must remain guided by this framework, this governance framework that promotes safety, order, and regular migration. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, what's your view on this?
Yes, first of all, I want to clarify that I'm completely with Antonia that it's a critical global framework and that ideas are important, and ideally we would follow it. And I would hope that EU member states would be more united around it. But unfortunately, what I was mentioning is that politically this is not the case. And I think we've seen this very clear with COVID-19 measures on, if we look at the Greek-Turkish border, if we look at somehow EU member states have also limited the assessment of asylum requests, and yes, under the cover of COVID-19, but I don't think that was necessarily with a view in the spirit of the Global Compact. But even before that, I felt looking at some individual EU member state policies that actually had sort of signed up to the compact, I felt that some of these are not in line or in the spirit, and it's also a bit difficult because some of the language of the compact is broad, so you kind of stay with the spirit and what is allowed and what isn't. But I feel in Europe we're not there yet, and I also don't feel it. I think some EU member states are fully behind, and at the global level they champion it. That's not what I want to say, but in the EU discussions, it doesn't appear in the statements or when there's discussions on the EU-Africa partnership. Again, also because some EU member states would just block these joint positions, so there is no joint common position. And it's a question of whether that we'd be overcoming. But I think in that situation politically, what the best we can do is sort of point out and highlight when some things are actually not in the spirit, and when there could be also then push from the African side to make sure it is. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions already, so please, for the audience, please ask your questions. We're very happy to include you in this conversation. I'll take two questions now and then let the speakers answer. So we had a question from Dedovic about skills mobility partnerships.
So my name is Tanja Dedovic, and I actually work for the International Organization for Migration. And I really thoroughly enjoyed this very good presentation of Joy on the UN, on the Global Compact on migration. Likewise, I thought that the analysis of the positions of the EU versus the African Union member states on the GCM by Anne Knoll was really interesting. I just wanted to maybe highlight this whole concept of skills mobility partnerships a little bit more, and maybe the potential role of these skills mobility partnerships in, for example, also the EU-AU partnership. What we see as IOM is that, like Anna also was saying, there are very different positions within the EU when it comes to mobility schemes. Mobility schemes primarily understood as permanent migration schemes, whereas the skills mobility partnerships that we have promoted also within the Global Compact on Migration, the concept was launched with the GCM in Marrakesh in 2018, is indeed that there is a cooperation between countries of destination and countries of origin in identifying the skills needed in countries of origin and countries of destination, and there would be a partnership in the sense that there would be a cost sharing also between the two sides in investing in the training and the skills developments in the country of origin, so that there would be a pool of trained workforce in the country of origin from which the country of destination can also draw, but that would primarily also benefit the country of origin as a whole, because it would increase the skills and the productivity in the countries of origin. We believe that this concept of skills mobility partnerships could be quite important both for intra-continental labor mobility, as Joy was mentioning, in facilitating the movement, the free movement, and even more so the free trade of services and goods. Something that we are also working on with the EUC at the continental level in the Joint Labor Migration Program, but also between the AU and the EU. So there is a first such flagship project, let's say, between North Africa and Germany, where the idea of this mobility.
So we can include other questions also, please.
Yes, this is the end. So I just wanted to point out that there is a first such flagship project where the EU, in the framework of this migration pact and under the EU Trust Fund, is implementing such a project to test mobility schemes. So I just wanted to highlight a potential possible role of such skills mobility partnerships that are very much in line with GCM and that could bring together the two sides. Over.
Thank you very much. And I think there's definitely room for perhaps organizing additional seminars on more sort of niched or focused policy areas, for example, these partnerships. And we would be very happy to include the IOM there. So thank you for that reflection. I'll take 2 questions now, since this first was more of a reflection or a comment. I'll take questions from our good friend and a contributor to the book I mentioned in the beginning, Willy Eselebor.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I want to see, the Global Compact seems to be an elitist concept, because my recent engagement with border community revealed that most of the people who are supposed to benefit from this compact are not even aware that it exists, which means a lot needs to be done. And it goes back to the whether it engages with the local community that's supposed to benefit from this. Again, you also see the civil society is not well formed in Africa because migration is a specialized area. So how are we going to deal with this issue? What role, if any, for the private sector? Because the private sector benefits more from labor or migration. So these are this question is for the 2 presenters. What role, if any, for the private sector? Because without engaging with the private sector, I'm I'm doubting whether it's going to succeed. It might go the way of the Millennium Development Goals. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the concise question. And Dr. Eselebor's chapter to our book is about civil society involvement. So very pertinent question there. Let's take another one. I had another friend of this community is Jan Bade. I saw him in the... Hello.
Yes, hello, Jesper. Thank you very much. Just a small comment from my side. I hear many people talking about the options and possibilities of legal migration, which I think is great. But from the EU policy side, the EU worries about irregular migration. So I always look for possibilities to have this exchange between irregular migration, limiting irregular migration from Africa to Europe in exchange for more options for legal migration. And I would like to hear more about how people see those options and whether also the African countries are prepared to limit irregular migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll take one last question and then I'll allow the speakers to reflect on what we've heard so far. If that's okay with the speakers, can you manage another? Yeah, okay. So a final question for this round, Abdul Karim Ilgoni.
Yes, my brief question is thank you very much. Actually, I have noticed in South Africa during the last the lockdown that so many of the economic migrants have informed us that it would have been better for them if they were in their country. And this has come from so many professionals, which I believe might have some impact on the economic migrants moving forward. They will ask themselves questions before they leave. So I'm just asking, are we going to do some research on this, use it to inform people and reduce irregular migration and push towards legal migration, as Jan has just mentioned? Can that be possible?
All right. Thank you very much. So let's hear from the 2 speakers, just any reflections you have on the issues brought up so far. I should also just say that Anne Pakoa Tao's reflections are now available in the chat. I'm sorry for the technical issues, Anne. The speakers you don't have to address that now, but just for everyone to see, there's a reflection there and a question in the chat. But please, let's hear from Joy first. What are your reactions to the issues raised by the audience so far?
Thank you very much, Jesper. Thank you very much for all of the questions. I think they really raise the systemic issues around a conversation on migration and the options within various disciplines that can contribute to facilitating safe and orderly migration. And then they also raised this elephant in the room question around irregularity. So let's start with the lady from IOM. I think that she really gave us those options. I think it's important to think about the Global Compact as setting the important governance framework, but then leaving it really for the domestication in processes, migration itself being a cross-border matter. So leaving it within the relations of states to be informed and inspired by the aspirations and the commitments of the Global Compact, to then have migration governance regimes that protect people, that promote safety, that promote regularity. And I like very much the point she made around the temporary mobility movement, because I think every migrant typically wants to stay home if home can fulfill their dreams. And every migrant would like to go and have opportunities where they are, but have the opportunity to go back home. They miss their families, they work for their families. This is the notion of remittances. And so very much the circularity in mobility is critical as part of the solutions, because then you get out of this permanent structure which threatens people and get more into building temporary movement. There are interesting regimes in the trade landscape, the landscape from ICANN, which can give answers to this. The EU itself has made a series of commitments for trade liberalization in sectors which require people to move to provide those services. The problem is that these commitments have been largely typically limited to very highly skilled professionals. How do we democratize that space? By bringing in a broad range of what we typically call irregular migrant type people to produce, to supply services in these areas. And I think these are the ideas, part of which IOM was talking about, but I just wanted to plant the role of the World Trade Organization there, the role of the African Continental Free Trade in those areas. The second point I'd like to talk about is the elitist concept. I think it's a fair comment. We are sort of constrained by the construct of international relations and how you develop norms and how you develop treaties. You have to start somewhere. But I think it's the work then of countries, of sub-regional institutions, to really democratize this knowledge and make it available to everybody. Let's recall that Africa has gone much, much further than any of these regimes would be talking about. When we talk about ECOWAS, when we talk about the African Union, when we talk about the East African Community, we're talking about a rights-based approach. As a Ugandan, I can go and reside and settle and establish in Kenya. These are replicated across various sub-regional contexts in Africa. How do we make sure that these ideas are known to people so that people are empowered? And I think it's important, the point, to break from elitist and bring it down to the people. The third point is this question around how do you create new opportunities? I think you create new opportunities for regular migration by ensuring that the push factors are curtailed. People should move because they want to move. People shouldn't be forced to move. And this is why we were proposing some of these ideas around how do you use trade and investment? How do you use enterprise support? How do you use empowerment programs to create those opportunities for people to find and fulfill their dreams at home? There is a role for investing in people, and I think COVID-19 gives us an excellent opportunity for a new development type strategy, development 2.0, that has people at the heart. Because when people can self-actualize, they will move, but they will move for different reasons. And then, of course, the question of protection is critical. The stories, the life experience of irregular migrants are concerning. And I think this is precisely why you have the Global Compact, because it spotlights the challenges of there by insisting on safety, by insisting on order, by insisting on regularity. The final point I will make is that migration is with us. It has been with us from the beginning, and it will remain with us. Migration is a force for good. All societies have migrated historically. Europe in Africa, Africa in Europe, Europe across the world. And so we must embrace it as really that force of human nature that can bring out the best of us. And then we must use that as a basis to understand that we will not succeed by building sort of those barriers that create the harsher policies, but rather by understanding how can we enhance its role? By making sure that when people move, they're moving not because they're forced to move. We do that by investing in the communities where people are so that they can self-actualize through opportunities at home to fulfill their dreams.
All right, thank you very much. So we're approaching the end of our time, so I'll ask Anna to provide her final reflections, and then we will conclude the webinar. I also just want to draw your attention to, not perhaps while Anna is talking, but there's a comment from our good friend Kabele Matlosa in the chat as well. We'll try to copy the comments from the chat and provide a summary of the discussion afterwards for you all. But please, Anna, do you have some reflections on the issues raised by the audience?
Yes, thank you, Jesper. I can reflect a bit on the Skills Mobility Partnership and the question that Jan mentioned on the elephant in the room of irregular versus regular pathways. I mean, I think the incentives to really reduce irregular migration obviously depends for each government and country, but it's not always very strong, because there's strong gains also from irregular migration, whether it's a economic wealth for young people to leave, whether it's the remittances, whether it's also linked to corruption at times. So it's a huge issue, and it's a huge, also maybe sometimes linked to security questions. And so far I feel, I mean, legal pathways may be one option, but what we've seen and what Tanya has mentioned on the Commission sort of pilot schemes, I'm very much in favor of them, but they're very small scale. We're talking usually about 20, 40, maybe 100 people that come in. I think it's a good testing ground to see how some of these schemes work. I think the EU Commission had the issue that very few EU member states actually signed up, even for these small schemes. They're quite expensive for now, but it's okay to test and then maybe learn from it. And the hope is that you can have useful outputs that can then be scaled up. Then I think there's two questions on that. You know, does that help to reduce irregular migration? One, through channeling some of the people that may have migrated irregularly through these. Then again, that needs to be at a large scale to actually be meaningful. But I also doubt that for all countries where we do see irregular migration, the jobs that are actually needed in Europe really match. So then again, that point I made before, that in a long-term partnership, this will need to be integrated with the education and the labor market sort of matching component for those economies where it's viable. The second avenue could be that you incentivize governments to be more strongly, looking at how to address irregular migration by incentivizing and making it more feasible political for them, because they can say, as a gain, we get these mobility opportunities. But here again, I feel for now what EU member states are prepared to offer, and maybe some are more generous than others, I wonder whether that's at the scale that is actually needed to create these incentives. So for me, that's a very long-term sort of project, but I feel that it hasn't even really started to kind of bring both together. Yeah, that's my reflection on it.
All right. Dr. Matlosa, if you're here with us still, would you like to share your reflection with us in person? And welcome.
Thank you so much, Jesper. And let me also thank the panelists for a very thought-provoking session we've had and their insights. I wanted just to, because my intervention also draws from what I'm seeing from the African Union itself. That's where I'm coming from. So that's why I'm raising basically 2 points for reflection. It's not even a question, really. It's for us to keep thinking about. One is that the compact, like a number of norms that exist at the African Union level, is a norm. So we need to interrogate the norm beyond the norm. To what extent is this norm becoming practice in changing the lives of migrants for the better? So that's the key question, because we need to address the gap between norm entrepreneurship and norm implementation. For example, in the context of COVID-19 now, as we speak in this seminar, we're seeing intensification of racism against African migrants all over the place. Right? We're seeing xenophobia intensifying. We're seeing stigma. Now, that is why I'm saying we need to also interrogate the compact vis-a-vis the lived experience of migrants. That's number one, Chair. Number two, lastly, it links to the point that another colleague raised about elitism. But I'm putting it in a different context to say, besides this being elitist, we are also discussing a state-centric project. It is driven by states, members of the UN, the same as it will be. Some of these norms are driven by the members of the African Union in Addis. Now, the question is, how do we then make sure that we have the fuller picture in our discussion, such that we are not only talking about the compact, but we're also talking about how non-state actors are interrogating the compact itself and making it a lived experience. So, for example, the involvement of migrants themselves in the actualization of the compact, but also civil society and think tanks interrogating what this means for Africa. That's just the thought, Chair. Thank you so much. And thanks, Ade.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madlosa. Good to hear from you, and thank you for your reflections. We will certainly bring them with us. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we have to wrap up now. I see there are a few unanswered questions coming in, but we will try to take them on board in our reflections, and I'll just pass the word on very shortly to my colleague, Dr. Akinola, to perhaps also mention some of the expected outputs from these webinars. I just want to thank you all for participating, especially our two excellent speakers. I think that it is clear that migration as a policy area reaches from the very broad idealism at global and regional levels to the very pragmatic policy implementation levels, and is, as we all know, is a hotly debated and intensely felt subject for many stakeholders. So it is always interesting to engage in these discussions that span the broad ideological scopes and the sort of the nitty-gritty of what to actually do to move forward on these issues. So thank you very much for that and for the audience's comments and questions. I will hand over now to my, so far, a long-distance friend and collaborator, the co-editor of the book I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Akinola, to send us off from today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesper, for your role in moderating this event. I thank you also for permitting me and giving me the opportunity to appreciate everyone present with us today, particularly our two speakers, Dr. Joy and Ms. Ananol. Thank you for the engaging conversation you have with us. And to our guests, our special two directors who have done everything to make today's event possible. Thank you so much. To the University of Johannesburg Library, those officials that have done everything to also make today possible. Thank you very much. Please, may I quickly remind you that we will send out an evaluation form, please. Please kindly, quickly, and promptly attend to this and send it back to us. I know it will take less than 5 minutes or 10 minutes for you to do this. Please, we also want to inform you, as we did in the last meeting, that policy briefs and newspaper articles will be the outputs and part of the outputs of this meeting. And please, I want to ask you to please enjoy the weekend. Please be safe.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.